Most people don't realize that over-explaining isn't really a communication issue. It's not about clarity. It's not about wording things better. It's usually a learned response, one that formed quietly, long before you ever noticed it happening. If you find yourself explaining your choices, your feelings, or your boundaries far more than feels necessary, especially to people who don't seem to listen anyway, this isn't because you lack confidence, and it's not because you're bad at asserting yourself. More often, it's because at some point, being understood started to feel like something you had to earn. What usually happens is subtle. No one sits you down and teaches you to over-explain. Instead, you begin to notice that simple statements don't land. That no creates tension. That saying what you need without justification leads to discomfort, sometimes silence, sometimes disapproval. And slowly, without deciding to, you adjust. You add context. You soften your words. You explain your reasoning in advance, hoping that if people understand why, they won't push back. Over time, explanation starts to feel safer than clarity. What's important to understand is that this pattern often forms in environments where emotional reactions mattered more than emotional truth, where misunderstanding had consequences, where being misread felt risky. So you learn to anticipate, to manage the emotional response before it even happened. Over-explaining becomes a way to stay connected, a way to stay safe, a way to prevent other people from becoming uncomfortable. And because it works, at least sometimes, the pattern stays. But here's where it quietly turns draining. Because explanation doesn't actually create boundaries, it creates negotiation. When you explain too much, your needs start to sound like requests for approval. Your limits start to sound like invitations for debate. And not everyone debates in good faith. Some people don't need more clarity. They need access. They need flexibility. They need you to keep explaining long enough that your boundary begins to soften. This isn't about blame. It's about recognizing patterns. When you over-explain, you unintentionally teach others that your clarity is negotiable, that if they question it long enough, it might change. And people respond to the emotional cues they're given. Over-explaining often communicates uncertainty, even when you feel very sure inside. What's especially difficult is that the people who over-explain the most are often the most thoughtful, the most self-aware, the most willing to reflect. You see nuance. You understand multiple perspectives. You want to be fair. So of course you explain. You're not trying to give up your power. You're trying to stay kind without losing connection. But the cost of that effort often shows up later, as resentment, as exhaustion, as the quiet realization that you're doing more emotional labor than the situation requires. At some point, it becomes important to notice this. Boundaries don't require justification to be valid. They don't need to be defended to exist. Not everyone is entitled to your reasoning. And letting someone feel disappointed or uncomfortable is not the same as doing something wrong. This doesn't mean you need to stop explaining entirely. It means becoming conscious of why you're explaining in each moment. Are you offering context because you genuinely want to share? Or because you're trying to manage how someone else reacts? Are you clarifying because it feels aligned? Or because silence feels unsafe? There's no judgment in these questions, only information. And information is where choice begins. When you start to see over-explaining as a strategy rather than a flaw, something shifts. You don't need to force yourself to speak less. You don't need to rehearse stronger boundaries. You only need to notice the moment before the explanation starts, the moment your body prepares to manage someone else's response. That pause is protective, because in that pause, you're no longer giving away clarity in exchange for safety. You're allowing your words to stand without defense, without negotiation, without apology. Not confrontation, not control, just self-respect. And over time, that's what changes the pattern, not by becoming harder, but by becoming more anchored. You don't have to change how you speak today. You don't have to draw new boundaries tonight. Just notice what feels urgent to explain. And ask yourself whether clarity might already be enough.